Logic versus deception. Can an archivist outsmart a cunning adversary? The road narrowed long before Evelyn Hart realized she had lost signal entirely. The last bar of reception disappeared just as the asphalt dissolved into a winding ribbon of gravel, swallowed by towering pines that blocked out the sky like cathedral pillars. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, as if hesitation itself might turn the forest against her. This was Oregon, but not the version printed in travel magazines. This was something quieter, older, and far less forgiving. She had accepted the job 3 weeks ago, sitting at a small kitchen table that still carried the weight of unpaid bills and a silence that had become claustrophobic. The email had been precise, almost clinical, a private archival position, well compensated, remote, requiring discretion. No interview beyond a single video call where Arthur Forrest's face had been a study in shadows and sharp angles. She had said yes before doubt could take shape, driven by a hollow necessity that made the isolation of Oregon feel less like a retreat and more like a tactical repositioning. The gates appeared without warning. Black steel, minimalist, embedded into a stone wall that seemed carved directly from the earth. They opened before she even came to a full stop. Someone had been watching. Evelyn felt it immediately, not fear, but awareness. This place was controlled, measured. Nothing happened by accident. The estate revealed itself slowly as she drove through. Clean lines of glass and dark wood, structured against the wildness of the forest like a deliberate contradiction. It did not attempt to blend in. It imposed order. Large windows reflected nothing but trees, turning the house into something almost invisible from certain angles. Beautiful, yes, but not welcoming. Evelyn parked where the gravel transitioned into smooth stone. For a moment, she stayed inside the car, hands resting on her knees, listening. No distant traffic, no voices, just wind moving through branches, steady and indifferent. She exhaled, slow and controlled, then stepped out. The front door opened before she reached it. Arthur Forrest stood in the doorway. He was taller than she expected, posture straight without rigidity, dressed in a way that suggested simplicity but carried intention. Dark sweater, neutral tones, nothing that drew attention, and yet everything about him did. His expression was composed, almost unreadable, but not cold. Observing, measuring. "You're on time," he said. His voice was calm, low, without unnecessary emphasis. "I prefer it that way," Evelyn replied. A brief pause followed, not awkward, but evaluative, as if both of them understood that first impressions here would not be forgotten or forgiven. He stepped aside. "Come in." The interior mirrored the exterior philosophy. Open space, controlled light, clean surfaces. No clutter, no excess. Every object had purpose. Evelyn noticed the absence more than the presence. No personal photographs, no signs of life beyond function. It felt less like a home and more like a system. Arthur closed the door behind her. The sound echoed slightly, contained by the architecture. "You'll be working primarily in the West Wing," he said, already moving, expecting her to follow. "The collection hasn't been cataloged in years. I need it organized, digitized, and cross-referenced. Accuracy matters more than speed." "That won't be a problem," Evelyn said. "I assume not." They moved through a corridor lined with glass, the forest visible on one side like a silent audience. Evelyn matched his pace, noting the rhythm of his steps, the lack of hesitation in his movements. He knew every angle of this place. The library doors were heavy, wood contrasting the rest of the structure. Arthur opened them without ceremony. The room inside shifted everything. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, dense with books, leather-bound volumes, rare editions, manuscripts protected behind glass. The air carried that distinct scent of paper and time. Unlike the rest of the house, this space felt lived in. Not chaotic, but alive. Evelyn stepped inside slowly, instinctively lowering her voice even though there was no one else present. "This is extensive," she said. Arthur watched her reaction, not the room. "You recognize some of them." It wasn't a question. She moved closer to one of the shelves, eyes scanning titles. First printings. Annotated copies. Some of these shouldn't even be in private hands. "And yet they are," he said. There was no arrogance in his tone, just fact. Evelyn turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "You're not collecting for display." Another pause. Shorter this time. "No," Arthur said. I'm preserving context. That answer settled somewhere deeper than she expected. Not performance. Not wealth signaling. Something else. She nodded once. Then we'll need a system that reflects that. Not just cataloging by author or date, but by intellectual lineage. Influence chains. Marginalia connections. Arthur's expression shifted. Barely, but enough. Interest. Explain, he said. Evelyn stepped fully into the space now, already mapping it in her mind. If a writer references another, directly or indirectly, that relationship matters, especially if you have annotated copies. The notes can reveal intention, disagreement, reinterpretation. It turns the collection into a conversation, not an archive. Silence followed again, but this time it held weight. Arthur walked past her, stopping near a glass case. Most people focus on value, he said. Market value. Rarity. They're missing the point, Evelyn replied. He looked at her then, directly, not analyzing anymore. Considering. Yes, he said. The word was quiet, but definitive. For the first time since arriving, Evelyn felt something shift, not in the environment, but in the space between them. It wasn't comfort. Not yet. But it was alignment. A shared understanding that didn't need to be explained twice. Arthur gestured toward a desk positioned near the center of the room. You can start tomorrow morning. Everything you need is here. If it isn't, you tell me. I will. He nodded once. Efficient. Controlled. As he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway, just briefly. One more thing, he said without looking back. This place works on trust. If something feels unclear, you ask. Assumptions create problems. Evelyn watched him, measuring the statement. It wasn't a warning. It was a rule. Understood, she said. He left without another word. The door closed, softer this time. Evelyn stood alone in the library, surrounded by voices preserved in ink and margin notes. The forest pressed quietly against the glass beyond, a reminder that isolation here was not accidental, it was chosen. She exhaled slowly, letting the silence settle instead of resisting it. This was not just a job. That much was already clear. The structure of the house, the precision of Arthur's expectations, the intention behind the collection, everything pointed to something deeper than simple work. She placed her bag on the desk, running her fingers lightly across its surface. Control. That was the word that defined this place. And somewhere beneath it, she sensed something else. Not yet visible, not yet understood, but present. Morning arrived without announcement. No distant city noise, no gradual rise of human activity, just light filtering through the glass walls and the quiet persistence of the forest. Evelyn woke before her alarm, disoriented for a second by the unfamiliar stillness, then grounded herself quickly. This was the environment now. Controlled. Contained. She dressed simply, tied her hair back, and moved through the corridor toward the west wing. The house felt different in daylight, not warmer, but more defined. Shadows had retreated, revealing the exactness of every surface, every angle. Nothing here was accidental. The library door was already open. Arthur stood near the central desk, sleeves slightly rolled, a tablet in one hand. He didn't look up immediately when she entered. You're early, he said after a moment. So are you. A brief pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but acknowledgement. I prefer to understand the process before it begins, he said. Evelyn set her bag down, already scanning the layout again, sharper this time. Then we should start with classification parameters. If the structure is wrong at the beginning, everything collapses later. Arthur placed the tablet on the desk. Agreed. There was no small talk. No unnecessary adjustment period. They moved directly into the work, as if both had silently agreed that anything else would be inefficient. Evelyn opened one of the volumes closest to her, a worn but carefully preserved edition, margins dense with notes. She didn't comment immediately. Instead, she read. Processed. Mapped. Arthur watched her, not intrusively, but with focus. These annotations, she said finally, they're not casual. They're layered. Initial reactions, then revisions. You've returned to the same texts multiple times. Yes. You argue with the authors. Another pause. Sometimes they're wrong, he said. Evelyn glanced up, meeting his gaze. And sometimes, they're incomplete. The answer landed with precision. Not dismissive. Not arrogant. Just exact. Evelyn nodded slightly, then turned a few pages. Then the system needs to track that evolution. Not just what's written, but when it was written relative to your other notes. Otherwise, we lose the progression of thought. Arthur stepped closer now, just enough to look at the page without invading her space. Can that be done without compromising the physical integrity of the books? Yes. We digitize the annotations separately, layer them in metadata. Time-stamped entries, cross-referenced with related texts. He considered that. And accuracy? Manual verification, she said. No automation for interpretation. Only for storage. Another silence. This one longer. Then, a single nod. Do it. The decision came quickly, but not carelessly. Evelyn recognized that immediately. Arthur didn't hesitate once he was convinced. The hesitation happened before, internally, where it wasn't visible. They worked side by side after that, establishing the framework. No wasted movement. No repeated explanations. Each adjustment built on the last. Time passed differently inside the library. It didn't stretch or compress, it focused. By midday, they had outlined a full structural model, something that would have taken weeks in a standard institutional setting. Evelyn stepped back from the desk, rolling tension out of her shoulders. We'll need to segment the collection physically as well. Not permanently, but in phases. Otherwise, cross-referencing will slow everything down. Arthur leaned against the edge of the desk, arms loosely crossed. You're suggesting temporary disruption of the current order. Yes. That order has been consistent for years. And it's inefficient for what you want now, Evelyn said calmly. No challenge in her tone. Just fact. Arthur studied her for a moment. Not defensive. Evaluating. Fine, he said. You'll have full access to the space. If something needs to be moved, it gets moved. Evelyn inclined her head slightly. Understood. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. Authority had been transferred. Not entirely, but enough. Trust wasn't declared. It was demonstrated through permission. They paused briefly for coffee in the adjoining room. Even that felt structured. Clean surfaces, minimal objects, everything placed with intention. Evelyn leaned lightly against the counter, cup in hand, watching the way light moved across the glass walls. You don't get many visitors, she said. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He set his cup down with controlled precision. No, he said finally. By choice. Yes. Evelyn nodded once, not pressing further. The answer was complete as it stood. But a moment later, Arthur added, most people bring variables I don't need. She glanced at him. And I don't. Another pause. Short. Focused. You haven't, he said. Not a compliment. Not exactly. But not neutral either. Evelyn looked back at her coffee, considering that. Give it time, she said quietly. Arthur's gaze lingered on her for a fraction longer than necessary. Then he looked away. They returned to the library without further comment. The afternoon shifted from structure to execution. Evelyn began the initial cataloging, testing the system in real time, adjusting as needed. Arthur remained nearby, occasionally reviewing entries, asking precise questions that forced refinement rather than repetition. At one point, Evelyn reached for a volume on a higher shelf, stretching slightly. Before she could adjust her balance, Arthur stepped in, retrieving it with ease and placing it on the desk in front of her. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, already stepping back. No lingering. No unnecessary proximity. But the moment registered. Later, as the light outside softened and the forest deepened into shadow again, Evelyn closed the last book for the day. Her movement slowed, not from fatigue, but from the awareness that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but the distance between professional interaction and something else, something less defined, had narrowed. Arthur stood near the window now, looking out at the darkening trees. For a moment, he seemed almost separate from the space he controlled, as if the structure held him as much as he held it. Evelyn watched him briefly, then spoke. We made more progress than expected. Yes. He didn't turn immediately. Efficiency tends to follow clarity, he added. Evelyn allowed a small, restrained smile. And control. That made him look at her. Control is necessary, he said. Until it isn't, she replied. Silence. Not tense. Not comfortable. Just real. Arthur held her gaze for a second longer than usual, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then he inclined his head slightly. We'll continue tomorrow, he said. Evelyn nodded. Tomorrow. She gathered her things, leaving the library with the same measured steps she had entered with. But the space behind her no longer felt entirely closed. And neither did he. The shift began before Victoria Forrest even stepped into the house. It was late afternoon on the third day when the sound of a car broke the isolation, gravel compressing under controlled movement. Arthur said nothing about it at first. They worked as they had the previous day, focused, efficient, without wasted words. But there was a fraction more distance in him. Not coldness, not withdrawal, just recalibration. Evelyn noticed. She didn't address it. The engine cut cleanly, and a door closed with deliberate force. Arthur's hand paused over the page he had been reviewing. Just for a second. Then he closed the book. "She's here," he said. No explanation followed. None was needed. Evelyn straightened slightly, closing the file she had been working on. "Your sister?" "Yes." A beat of silence. "Does this affect the work?" she asked. Arthur's gaze shifted to her, steady. "Only if you let it." Not reassurance. Instruction. Evelyn nodded once. "Understood." The footsteps approached without hesitation. Measured, confident, perfectly timed. The door to the library opened without a knock. Victoria Forrest entered like she owned not just the room, but the structure holding it. Her eyes didn't just scan the shelves. They lingered on the 1924 ledger, the one Arthur had forbidden anyone to digitize until Evelyn arrived. There was a legacy of silence in this family, and Victoria was its self-appointed guardian. She was dressed in muted tones that carried more authority than any bright color could. Everything about her was controlled. Posture, expression, even the way her gaze moved across the space. She didn't look at Evelyn first. She looked at Arthur. "You didn't mention you hired someone," she said. Her voice was smooth, composed, with an undercurrent that suggested every word had already been weighed before being spoken. Arthur didn't move from where he stood. "I don't report my staffing decisions." A small pause. Not tension. Calibration. Victoria's eyes shifted then, landing on Evelyn with sharp precision. Not curiosity. Assessment. "And you are?" she asked. "Evelyn Hart." Evelyn said, tone even. "Archivist." Victoria stepped further into the room, heels barely making a sound against the floor. "Temporary, I assume." "Yes," Evelyn replied. No elaboration. Victoria's gaze lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, as if measuring not just the answer, but the absence of anything beyond it. She leaned in, the scent of expensive, cold perfume momentarily cutting through the room's dust and paper. "Arthur has managed this collection for years without assistance. He values the silence here. I wonder what you offered that convinced him to break it." Evelyn held her gaze, steady. "I offered a structure that works. Silence doesn't catalog itself." Victoria's eyes sharpened, a thin smile touching her lips that didn't reach her expression. "A structure is only as strong as its weakest point, Miss Hart. I'll be interested to see where yours is." Then she turned back to Arthur. She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back just slightly. Her gaze found Evelyn again, sharper this time, more focused. "Be careful with rare things, Miss Hart," she said. "They tend to be more fragile than they appear." A beat. Evelyn didn't look away. "I'm aware." Victoria held her gaze for a second longer, then inclined her head just enough to acknowledge the response. "Good," she said. Then she left. The door closed behind her with the same quiet precision it had opened. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It carried residue now. Arthur exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly. Evelyn didn't speak immediately. She allowed the moment to settle, to define itself before reacting to it. "That was a warning," she said finally. Arthur didn't deny it. "Yes." "About the work?" "No." Evelyn nodded once. "I didn't think so." Another pause. "Does she interfere often?" she asked. Arthur's gaze shifted toward the door, expression tightening just slightly. "Only when she sees a reason to. And now she does." "Yes." Evelyn looked back at the files on the desk, but her focus had shifted. The system they were building was still clear, still structured, but the environment around it had changed. Pressure had been introduced, and pressure, unlike structure, didn't follow rules. The presence of Victoria did not fade after her exit. It lingered in the structure of the house, subtle but pervasive, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. Nothing visibly changed, yet everything felt slightly recalibrated. Evelyn noticed it in Arthur first. He didn't withdraw. He didn't become distant in any obvious way, but his focus sharpened beyond its usual precision. as if every decision now carried an additional layer of evaluation. He worked longer without pause, asked fewer questions, and when he did, they were narrower, more exact. Evelyn adjusted accordingly. They moved through the system they had built, refining it under quiet tension. No wasted motion, no repeated discussion. The work itself became an anchor, something stable against the subtle disruption introduced into the environment. The work on the 70,000 characters of digitized drafts consumed the remaining hours of the day. As the light outside softened, Arthur finally closed a file, his movement precise. "Dinner is at 7, he said. "You should be there." Evelyn glanced at him. "Is that a request?" "No." She held his gaze for a moment, reading the intent behind the statement. "Not command. Not obligation. Necessity." "Understood," she said. The transition from work to evening carried no clear boundary. The house did not change atmosphere. It simply redirected focus. Evelyn returned to her room briefly, exchanging the simplicity of her work clothes for something equally restrained but more deliberate. Neutral tones, clean lines, no excess. Control, she reminded herself. Always control. The dining room was as precise as the rest of the house. Long table, minimal settings, everything placed with exact symmetry. Victoria was already there. She didn't stand when Evelyn entered. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the space without movement. Arthur arrived a moment later, taking his place at the head of the table. Evelyn sat opposite Victoria, the positioning too intentional to be accidental. Dinner began without formalities. For several minutes, there was only the quiet rhythm of utensils against porcelain. No forced conversation. No superficial exchanges. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was structured. Victoria broke the silence. "So," she said, her gaze resting on Evelyn, "how does one transition from literary theory to private employment like this?" The question was smooth, almost conversational. Evelyn set her glass down before answering. "Skill transfer." Victoria's expression remained composed. "That's an answer without information." "It's the relevant part," Evelyn replied. A brief pause. Arthur didn't intervene. He watched. Victoria leaned back slightly, studying her. "And the irrelevant part?" "Circumstantial," Evelyn said. "Financial?" "Yes." No hesitation. No attempt to soften the truth. Victoria's gaze sharpened, but not with judgment, with interest. "So this is temporary?" "Yes." "And when the circumstances change?" "I leave." The clarity of that answer settled into the space with quiet weight. Arthur's hand stilled briefly against the table, a microscopic hesitation that broke the mechanical rhythm of the room. He didn't look at Evelyn, but his thumb traced the rim of his glass with a sudden, sharp focus. Victoria's gaze darted between them, a predator catching the scent of a new, unidentified variable in a familiar environment. Victoria noticed. Of course she did. "How pragmatic," she said softly. Evelyn didn't respond. Another stretch of silence followed, but it was different now. Denser, more intentional. Arthur spoke then, his tone even. "The work is progressing ahead of schedule." Victoria shifted her attention to him. "I'm sure it is." "A beat. You've always been efficient when something holds your attention." The statement carried more than surface meaning. Arthur's gaze didn't change. "This is about the collection." "Of course," Victoria said. But the way she said it suggested otherwise. Dinner continued, each exchange measured, each pause carrying implication. Evelyn remained composed, responding only when necessary, never expanding beyond the question asked. She didn't challenge Victoria directly. She didn't retreat either. Balance. After the main course was cleared, Victoria set her glass down with deliberate care. "You should be careful, Miss Hart," she said, her tone almost thoughtful. "Environments like this can create misunderstandings." Evelyn met her gaze. "In what sense?" "In the sense that proximity can be mistaken for significance." A pause. Arthur's expression hardened slightly, though he said nothing. Evelyn didn't look at him. She kept her focus on Victoria. "I don't confuse the two." Victoria held her gaze, searching for something. Uncertainty, hesitation, anything that could be used. She didn't find it. "Good," she said. Another silence. Then Arthur stood. "That's enough." The words weren't raised. They didn't need to be. Victoria looked at him, expression unchanged. "I wasn't aware there was a limit." "There is," he said. A moment passed between them. Something older than the current conversation. Something unresolved but controlled. Then Victoria inclined her head slightly, as if conceding a point she hadn't intended to push further. Of course, she said. Evelyn remained seated for a second longer, allowing the tension to settle before she stood as well. The structure of the evening was clear. This interaction had reached its endpoint. Victoria rose last. As she moved past Evelyn, she paused just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be intentional. Temporary things, she said quietly, just for Evelyn to hear, rarely stay where they're placed. Then she continued walking. The room felt larger once she was gone. Not empty, just less compressed. Arthur remained standing near the table, his posture controlled, but the tension in it now visible if one knew where to look. Evelyn stepped closer, not intruding, but not distant either. That wasn't about misunderstanding, she said. No, Arthur replied. It was a warning. Yes. A pause. Evelyn studied him briefly. Does she always escalate this quickly? Arthur's gaze shifted toward the doorway Victoria had disappeared through. Only when she identifies a variable she can't control. Evelyn considered that. And I'm that variable. Yes. The answer was immediate. Not accusatory. Not defensive. Just precise. Evelyn nodded once. Then we continue. Arthur looked at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. Approval, perhaps. Or recognition. Yes, he said. We continue. The decision settled between them, quiet but firm. Outside, the forest remained unchanged. Dark. Still. Indifferent. Inside, the balance had shifted. She placed the pages back in order, aligning them with the same precision they had been arranged in. It's constructed well enough to pass a surface check, she said. But the structure is wrong. Arthur's gaze didn't shift. In what way? Evelyn tapped lightly on one of the statements. These transfers. The timing is too consistent. Real financial behavior isn't that clean unless it's automated. And if it were automated, there would be corresponding system identifiers. There aren't. She moved to the emails. The language is also off. It mimics intent without context. No escalation patterns, no negotiation shifts. Just linear progression toward a predetermined outcome. Silence followed. Arthur's expression remained controlled, but something beneath it tightened. You're saying it's fabricated? Yes. Immediate. Certain. A beat passed. And you expect me to accept that without question, he said. Evelyn met his gaze directly. No. I expect you to verify it. Another silence. Longer this time. Arthur's attention dropped briefly to the documents, then back to her. They were found in a secure channel. Secure doesn't mean accurate, Evelyn said. His jaw shifted slightly, not in anger, but in restraint. You're asking me to dismiss evidence. I'm asking you to examine it properly, she replied. The tension in the room didn't rise abruptly. It built, controlled, contained, but undeniable. Arthur stepped back slightly, creating space. And if it's not fabricated? Evelyn didn't hesitate. Then I leave. The words landed with clarity. No defense. No attempt to negotiate. Arthur studied her, searching, not for the answer, but for inconsistency within it. He didn't find any. That's a simple solution, he said. It's the correct one, Evelyn replied. Silence. Arthur turned away, moving toward the window. The forest beyond was unchanged, but his focus on it wasn't about the view. It was about distance. Evelyn remained where she was, not following, not retreating. She understood the moment for what it was. Not accusation. Not yet. Doubt. And doubt, once introduced, didn't disappear quickly. Where did you get these? She asked after a moment. Arthur didn't turn. They were left where I would find them. Evelyn nodded slightly. Then they were meant to be found. Yes. A pause. By you, she added. Arthur's gaze shifted, but he still didn't face her. Obviously. Not just found. Evelyn continued. Interpreted. That made him turn. Say what you mean, he said. Evelyn held his gaze. Someone wanted you to reach a specific conclusion before asking any questions. The statement settled heavily. Arthur's expression didn't change, but the precision in it sharpened. And you assume you know who that someone is? Yes. No hesitation. Victoria, he said. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Silence confirmed it. Arthur looked back at the documents, then at her again. That's a serious accusation. It's a logical one, Evelyn replied. Based on what? Timing. Access. Motivation. She stepped closer to the desk, not aggressively, but with intention. She arrived, assessed the situation, identified me as a variable, and within less than 24 hours, this appears. Arthur's gaze followed her movement. That's circumstantial. Yes, Evelyn said. But consistent. Another pause. And your alternative explanation? She asked. Arthur didn't answer immediately. That, more than anything, mattered. Evelyn saw it. The moment where logic and doubt collided, neither fully overriding the other. You had a past experience, she said carefully. Something that made you cautious. Arthur's expression hardened slightly. That's not relevant. It is, Evelyn said, because this is designed to trigger that response. Silence. For a second, something unguarded flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone. You're making assumptions, he said. Yes, Evelyn replied. So are you. The words hung between them, sharp but controlled. Arthur exhaled slowly, then walked back to the desk. He gathered the documents, aligning them again, restoring order to something that had disrupted it. I'll verify, he said finally. It wasn't trust, but it wasn't rejection either. Evelyn nodded once. That's all I asked. Another silence settled, heavier now, less neutral. The structure they had built was still intact. The system, the work, the logic, it all remained. But something had shifted underneath it. Not broken, not yet, but no longer stable. Verification did not happen immediately. Arthur didn't leave the library. He didn't make calls in front of her. He didn't initiate any visible process that would resolve the question placed between them. Instead, he continued working. Precisely, methodically, as if the documents had not introduced a fracture into the structure of the day. But the fracture was there. Evelyn felt it in the way he moved, slightly more controlled than before, if that was even possible. In the way his questions became fewer, sharper, stripped of any exploratory tone. He no longer built on her answers. He tested them. She adapted without comment. They worked in parallel, not quite side by side. The system continued to expand, correspondence section isolated, indexing adjusted, cross-references deepened. On the surface, progress remained consistent. Underneath, tension accumulated. By late afternoon, the silence had changed texture. It wasn't neutral anymore. It carried expectation. Arthur closed a file, placing it down with measured precision. You said the structure of the documents is wrong. Evelyn didn't look up immediately. She finished the annotation she was working on, then set her pen aside. Yes. Show me. Direct. Focused. Evelyn stood, moving to the desk where the documents had been left earlier. Arthur had not removed them. That, in itself, was intentional. She laid out the bank statements first. Look here, she said, pointing to a sequence of transfers. Intervals are identical, down to the minute. Arthur leaned closer, his attention fixed. Consistency isn't proof of fabrication, he said. No, Evelyn agreed. But absence of variance is. She slid another page forward. Real behavior fluctuates. Even automated systems show irregularities, processing delays, time zone shifts, batch inconsistencies. These don't. Arthur's gaze tracked the data, but his expression didn't shift. Continue. Evelyn moved to the printed emails. Now this. She tapped lightly on a paragraph. Language pattern. He read silently. Each message escalates in intent, she said, but without resistance. No hesitation. No counterpoints. It's a straight line toward agreement. Arthur looked up. That happens. Rarely, Evelyn replied. And when it does, it's because both sides already share context. These messages pretend that context exists, but never establish it. A pause. Arthur straightened slightly. You're analyzing tone. I'm analyzing structure, she said. Tone is a byproduct. Silence. For a moment, it seemed like the distance between them might close again, logic reasserting itself over doubt. Then Arthur stepped back. And yet, he said, your name is on every page. The shift was subtle, but decisive. Evelyn held his gaze. Because it was placed there. You don't know that. I do. Immediate. Certain. Arthur's jaw tightened slightly. Confidence isn't evidence. And suspicion isn't proof, Evelyn replied. The words landed cleanly. No escalation. No raised voices. But the tension sharpened. Arthur turned away again, moving toward the window. His reflection in the glass was faint, fragmented by the forest beyond. You're asking me to ignore a pattern, he said. I'm asking you to question who created it, Evelyn said. A pause. Arthur's voice lowered slightly. You're very certain for someone in your position. Evelyn didn't react to the implication. My position doesn't change the facts. He turned then, fully facing her. Your position changes the risk. There it was. Not accusation, but proximity to it. Evelyn absorbed that without visible reaction. And your response to that risk? Arthur didn't answer immediately. That hesitation mattered more than any statement. Finally, he said, I don't ignore variables. I didn't ask you to, Evelyn replied. I asked you to evaluate them correctly. Silence. The space between them held, tight, controlled, unresolved. Arthur walked back to the desk, gathering the documents again. This time, his movements were slightly less precise. Not careless, just pressured. I'll run independent verification, he said. Evelyn nodded. But until then, he added, we proceed with caution. The words were neutral. The implication wasn't. Evelyn understood it immediately. You think I might be involved? Arthur didn't respond directly. That was answer enough. A brief pause followed, long enough to acknowledge the shift, short enough to prevent it from expanding into something uncontrolled. Evelyn picked up her pen again, returning to the desk. Then you should monitor everything I do, she said calmly. Arthur's gaze fixed on her. I already do. No irony. No apology. Evelyn inclined her head slightly. Good. The conversation ended there. Not resolved. Contained. Work resumed. But it was no longer the same work. Every movement carried awareness now. Every decision was observed, measured, filtered through a layer that hadn't existed before. The system they had built still functioned, but trust, the invisible structure beneath it, had fractured. As evening approached, the light faded again, turning the glass walls into mirrors. Evelyn could see both the room and the faint outline of herself within it. For a moment, she allowed herself to stop. Not visibly, just internally. This was the point where most people would push harder, defend more, demand clarity. She didn't, because pressure, applied incorrectly, would only confirm the narrative being built against her. Control. She exhaled slowly, steadying her focus, and continued working. Across the room, Arthur stood still for a moment longer than necessary, watching her, not openly, but not entirely hidden either. Something in his expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but doubt, no longer singular. Now divided. The following morning, the library felt less like a sanctuary and more like a perimeter. The library didn't need an outside investigator to reveal its secrets. It only needed a focused mind. Evelyn didn't wait for a knock. She called Arthur to the central monitor, her fingers flying across the keys to pull up the raw system logs. The override didn't come from an external hack. Arthur, she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. It came from the terminal in the morning room, the one with the view of the North Gardens. She looked up as Victoria appeared in the doorway, frozen. The same room where you take your tea every morning, Victoria. Evelyn returned to her desk, resuming her work. Each keystroke, each annotation, was deliberate, precise, measured. She didn't allow the presence of potential observation to disrupt her process. Arthur moved to the window, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the forest. His reflection merged with the trees, as if both man and structure were under scrutiny. You're calm, he said without turning. Evelyn didn't look up. Control is necessary. Until it isn't, he replied. A pause. Her hand hovered over a file. And how do you define the point where it isn't? Arthur finally turned, meeting her gaze. When trust is compromised by assumption rather than evidence. The words struck quietly but firmly. Evelyn registered them, nodding slightly. You don't fully trust me yet, she said. Not entirely, he admitted. She returned to her work, but her awareness of his admission settled between them, unspoken yet potent. Later, when the forest outside darkened into evening shadow, Evelyn closed the final folder for the day. She stood, stretching briefly, and glanced at Arthur. Tomorrow, we isolate the fabricated threads further, she said. We separate what is real from what is engineered to deceive. Arthur's nod was slight, controlled, but something in it acknowledged more than just the plan. They both understood. Victoria's presence had escalated. The stakes were no longer abstract. Trust, observation, and manipulation now intersected within every action, every word, every pause. Evelyn left the library quietly, aware that the night would carry weight. Arthur remained, silent, watching the forest, the house, and the subtle cracks in the structure he had always thought unshakable. Change had arrived, not violently, but methodically, and nothing would remain exactly as it had been. The following day, the library felt less like a sanctuary and more like a perimeter. Evelyn had spent the night cross-referencing the internal terminal logs Grant provided against the 70,000-character archive. The mismatch was systemic. She was deep into the metadata of the top 30 historical scripts when the heavy oak doors swung open. Victoria didn't enter with her usual measured grace. She moved with the sharp, jagged energy of someone who had realized the walls were closing in. She stopped at the edge of the central desk, her gaze dropping to the specific file Evelyn had left open, the one highlighting the terminal override. "You're playing a very dangerous game with things you don't understand, Miss Hart," Victoria said, her voice dropping an octave. "Impressive," she said. "But anticipation isn't prevention." Arthur finally intervened, stepping forward. "This is not a test of competence. It's a measure of manipulation." Victoria tilted her head slightly, evaluating him, then Evelyn. "And yet, both of you assume control over a variable that resists total control." Evelyn did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to settle, to define the space between them. Then she spoke, precise and calm. "Manipulation is observable. Influence is measurable. You may test it, but you cannot hide it completely." Victoria's expression did not change, but the weight of Evelyn's words remained between them. She moved closer to the desk, eyes scanning the documents, absorbing the patterns, noting the precision, and then finally looked up. "You've learned quickly," she said. Evelyn inclined her head once. "Observation and logic." A brief pause. Victoria's gaze shifted to Arthur. "And he trusts this judgment?" Arthur's answer was subtle but firm. "Yes." For the first time in the house, Victoria's controlled facade wavered just slightly. Not in anger, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement of a force she had underestimated. Evelyn returned to her desk, resuming her work, noting patterns, reinforcing the structure, documenting every reaction. Victoria lingered, assessing, calculating, plotting next steps, but the initiative had shifted. Arthur remained near the window, observing both, the tension between strategy and manipulation palpable, balanced on the razor edge of anticipation. The forest outside remained indifferent, but inside, the balance of power had subtly changed. Evelyn, once a passive participant in the system, now became an active variable. And Victoria's next move would reveal whether control could be reclaimed, or whether the carefully constructed equilibrium would collapse under the weight of exposed manipulation. Evening settled over the house like a slow exhale. Shadows stretched across the glass walls, reflections of the forest merging with the interior, creating the illusion of depth and concealment. Evelyn remained at her desk, finishing the final annotations for the day, every movement measured, deliberate, precise. Arthur did not leave the window. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the trees, but his awareness was entirely inside the room. The quiet was deceptive. Victoria lingered, watching. Her presence was subtle, no words, no overt action, but it pressed against the atmosphere like weight on water. Evelyn did not respond to it, did not acknowledge it, yet every fiber of her attention registered its pressure. Finally, Victoria spoke. "I see you've adapted well. Perhaps too well." Evelyn looked up calmly. "Adaptation is necessary when variables are manipulated." Victoria stepped closer, eyes narrowing slightly. "And yet, you cannot anticipate everything. There are limits." Arthur shifted slightly, but did not intervene. His gaze remained steady, evaluating both women. Evelyn inclined her head. "Limits are defined by observation. They do not exist in abstract." Victoria's lips pressed together. She made no immediate reply, studying Evelyn, calculating intent, testing for hesitation. Finding none, she finally said, "Careful. You tread a fine line." "I am aware," Evelyn said, returning her attention to the documents in front of her. A brief silence followed. Arthur finally moved from the window, walking to the desk. His presence was deliberate but unobtrusive. He placed a hand on the edge of the table, close to Evelyn's work, but not touching. "She is testing you," he said quietly. Evelyn did not respond immediately. Then, in a controlled tone, she said, "And you?" Arthur's gaze met hers. "I am observing. But observation is different from manipulation." Victoria exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly. "Do you believe that, or is it convenient?" Arthur's jaw tightened slightly. Convenience does not define truth. Evelyn allowed the words to hang between them. Then she stood, placing the final folder into the organized stack. "I've accounted for her variables. Any further intrusion will be visible." Victoria tilted her head, expression unchanged, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of caution. "Bold," she said. Arthur's voice cut through the tension. "Enough. Any further action tonight is unnecessary." Victoria looked between them, measuring. Then, without another word, she turned and left, her steps controlled, precise, deliberate. The door clicked softly behind her. The room exhaled with her absence. Not relief. Exactly. More a subtle shift, a release of pressure that had been held taut. Evelyn returned to her desk, resuming the work that now carried an added layer of vigilance. Arthur lingered, then finally spoke. "You've handled her well." Evelyn did not look up immediately. "I respond only to what is real. Everything else is data." He considered that, then nodded slowly. "She will escalate. But now, the initiative is ours." Evelyn inclined her head. "Then we proceed deliberately. No shortcuts, no assumptions." Arthur's gaze softened fractionally, almost imperceptibly. "And the risk?" "Measured," Evelyn said. "Contained." The night deepened outside. Shadows merged with reflections. The house remained quiet, but the balance of power had shifted subtly yet decisively. Evelyn's precision, observation, and calm had placed her firmly as a variable no longer controlled by Victoria. Arthur returned to the window, watching the forest. Evelyn resumed her work, aware that the game had truly begun, and that every decision, every observation, every calculated movement would now determine who controlled the narrative. The silence that followed was different, not the silence of a library, but of a countdown. Evelyn looked from the terminal log to Victoria, then to Arthur, who remained as still as the trees beyond the glass. The 70,000 characters she had painstakingly organized were no longer just an archive. They were the benchmark against which every lie was now being measured. Victoria's hand tightened on the edge of the desk, the polished wood reflecting a fracture in her composure that hadn't been there before. "The archive is complete, Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice a steady anchor in the rising tension. She pointed to a specific sequence in the 70,000-character draft, a recurring syntactical error that appeared only in Victoria's private correspondence and a supposedly external threat. And the context it provides is undeniable. The leak wasn't a breach from the outside. It was an internal projection. Someone didn't just want to frame me. They wanted to see if you would prioritize your past trauma over the data in front of you. Evelyn leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You use a double semicolon after every rhetorical question, Victoria. It's a rare, archaic habit, one that appears in your private journals and, unfortunately for you, in the metadata of the threatening email sent to the server. You didn't just write the lie, you signed it with your own shadow." Arthur's gaze shifted from the screen to Victoria, the silence in the room expanding until it felt as heavy as the forest pressing against the glass. Victoria's hand tightened on the edge of the desk, the polished wood reflecting a fracture in her composure that hadn't been there before.